Hi everyone. Shua Tov, L'chaim. Tishbav's over. 3 weeks is over. On the way to Yerushalayim. We're going to begin in a few more months. Just hang in there, okay? Thank you.
This one, like during Kiddush, all of them consult a couple of girls and all the guys.
On Shabbos.
Yeah, Shabbos. For Kiddush.
Okay, good evening. Hello, hi. So we ask everyone to please close your cell phones unless you're waiting for your Aliyah application to be accepted, or you're waiting for someone to say they'll marry you, or you're going to ask them to marry you. Okay? Right. So, okay, so Shavua Tov, everyone. Welcome. I want to say hello to my mom. Hi, Mom. I want to say hello to my cousin Leslie, and of course, Mrs. Raskin, and friends from Las Vegas, Baltimore, Boston, Toronto, Pretoria, Jerusalem, LA, Chicago. Very nice. Okay, so welcome. And who else? Okay, thank you. All right, so tonight's class physically is being sponsored by my dear friend Maoz, in memory of Esty, Miriam, and Israel Volk. So Maoz, thank you. Maoz, thank you so much. And also we're dedicating the class today in memory of all our holy brothers and sisters and all those who perished a few blocks away. I'm working very hard at Simcha. This morning I had a Shiva call for a dear friend Maurizio Kaufman from Montevideo, who lost his mother and father. And also we went to the Levaya of my friend Brad Cohen. So all of our learning tonight should be in the zchut, in their merit, and also the merit of my friends' grandparents, the Volks. And also I want to give also Laura Seelig from Montreal, Manhattan. Thank you for helping sponsor the class. Okay, so with that, it's a heavy heart, but it's after Tisha B'Av, it's after 3 weeks, and now we go up, 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 and up. Okay, so tonight's class, usually Monday night's class is about the portion of the week, Parsha Shavua, but I thought, again, we need maybe a different energy, so it kind of was inspired, and it's going to be about the Gula, about the redemption. All right, so it's been a very, very intense 9 days. It's been a very, very intense 3 weeks. It's been a very, very intense year and a half. It's been a very intense 2 years. Okay, so please God, all of this will be behind us, and now we go higher and higher. So we're going to talk about the Gula, about the redemption of the Jewish people. Okay, about the redemption of the Jewish people. And we know that at a wedding, we discussed this before, at a wedding, the happiest moment of a couple's life, we break the glass. What a downer. What a downer. I heard this from Rabbi Simon Jacobson, and he said that if a Jew can't remember sadness at the time of great happiness, you can't remember happiness at the time of sadness. Sadness, unfortunately, sadness and simcha very often are juxtaposed. That a Jew knows that negativity and challenges are ephemeral, and goodness prevails. And even though it's been a very, very challenging 3 weeks and 9 days and 2 years, is that we know somehow from all this, only good's going to come. Though the syringe of life is in your arm, and you're getting the penicillin, it hurts like hell, but we know that that penicillin, that syringe, is only going to bring us to a better place. So we're with our brothers and sisters. Okay, so the name of the class is the Establishment of State of Israel and the beginning of the Gula, the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people. So Chazal, our sages teach us, how are you going to know when Mashiach is going to come? How do we know the redemption is coming? The Torah, we discussed this last week. We just began the last book of the Torah. There are 5 in Devarim. There's 3 different themes. Again, recapping last week, there's 3 different themes of Deuteronomy, of Devarim. One is a recapitulation of things that the Jewish people experienced in the Midbar, in the desert. Right? The last book of the Torah was written the last 36 days of Moses' life. And now the Jews are about to enter the land of Israel. So 1/3 is a recapitulation of the Jewish people's experience in the desert. Number 2 are the mitzvos and connections that Jews will need living in a decentralized nation. Up until now, 3 million Jews are traveling together. And now the Jews are about to go to the land of Israel, and the Jews will go live within their 12 different tribes. Hi, welcome. And then the third part of Devarim is Nevuah, prophecy about what is going to happen at the end of days. Okay, and the state of Israel, we're going to get to this in a few weeks, but the creation of the state of Israel is in the Torah. Yeah, we have to come back for Parsha Nitzavim. So how are we going to know Mashiach is coming? How do we know redemption is coming? So number 1, Chazal tell us when you see the Jewish people return to their land, when you see the Jewish people return to the land, start counting. And the next part, we'll get to this, is when you see the generation of Jews more connected than their grandparents, more than their parents. And I have a class assignment, go back tonight and ask your grandparents, or anyone who's older, okay, did they ever hear of someone who got more connected Jewishly, whatever that means, in their generation? And the answer will be no. You never heard of a person, a man or woman, being a chozeh b'tshuva before 50 years ago. Yes, there were times after the Crusades, after hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews were massacred, the Jews became more introspective, they reconnected a deeper way, but they were already observant. But you never had a Jew that checked out of Judaism in Vilna or Berlin or Budapest by and large, whose grandchild became more observant than the grandparent. It never happened. Rabbi Norman Lanz from La Bracha, President of University, told me this. You never saw someone like myself or many people who are listening in the room. So when you see the Jews come back to the land, and you see, but it's very confusing because at the same time we have the Baal Tshuva experience happening, you have massive assimilation. We're seeing assimilation rates which we haven't seen, but at the same time, established in the state of Israel, 1948. Okay, so we're going to get to the portion, Ha'azinu, the end of Devarim, right? Deuteronomy, and Ha'azinu, there's a pasuk, there's a sentence that says, Zachar Yemos Olam. Zachar Yemos Olam, which means Zachar, which means remember, Zachar Yemos, the days of, Yom, Yemos, the days of Olam. Remember the days of the world. What does that mean? The Torah is giving us a chiyuv, giving us responsibility. Look at your history, Jewish people. Look at your history, and it doesn't make sense. The Romans, the Mesopotamians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, communists, the Nazis, they're gone and we're around. 3,000 years later, we're still around. Look at your history and you'll see how your history doesn't make sense. But then Rabbi Pesach Kron, I heard, says we individually also have a chiyuv. We also have an obligation to give over remember the hashgacha pratis, the divine providence of our own lives. In other words, when you see something in your life that Hashem, the Almighty God, intervened, your job, your apartment, something, you have a chiyuv, he says, you have an obligation to give it over to another Jew. Why? Because it gives them encouragement, gives them pitachon. So again, we have a chiyuv in Ha'azinu. Look at your history individually, collectively. If we look at the state of Israel, now I don't know everyone on Zoom, I don't know everyone on the dial-in, I know most people in my apartment right now, but before 1948, no one would have believed that in 1948 we would have our homeland, right? It was a dream. I used to ask my grandmothers, did you ever believe that we would have our country of our own? It was a dream, something. Everyone listening tonight basically grew up in their lives with Israel as a fact, right? No one here on Zoom, on dial-in, physically, ever grew up without the state of Israel, okay? We take it for granted. We get on a plane, for COVID at least, 11 hours later, we all grew up. But from a Torah, first of all, from a historical point of view, yes, thank you very much. From a historical point of view, it doesn't make any sense that people who were exiled 2,000 years ago would come back to their land. And again, I've referenced this many times. If you would have asked a Jew, you have a friend, my friend, Roxanne Hubert, his father was a Holocaust survivor. If you would have asked Mr. Hubert in the concentration camp, so maybe he would have believed it. Do you believe in 3 years after the Holocaust, you'll have a country of your own navy, your own army, speaking Hebrew? Who would have believed such a thing? Who would have believed it? Yet it happened. So from a historical point of view, the state of Israel was an unbelievable historical miracle. From a spiritual point of view, it's beyond amazing. 70 times a day, 70 times a day, a traditional Jew prays in the morning, afternoon, in the evening, for Kadam grace after meals, that someday we would return to the land of Israel and, of course, build the Beis Hamikdash. In our lifetime, every one of us, we have seen the creation of the state of Israel. All right, fighting for its life against 150 million Arabs and taking in millions and millions of people. So Zachor Yemos Olam, and we take Israel for granted, but we're living, mamish, really, and Lubavitch Rebbe said this many times, open your eyes, Reb Shlomo Kava, open your eyes, is Mashiach is coming. And so it's very hard, but we're living in a generation. Okay, so the establishment, and again, why am I choosing this topic? Because we just finished Tisha B'Av, and please God, that was the last Tisha B'Av yesterday. That took tremendous satisfaction knowing, please God, it was the last time I'm ever gonna have to fast, okay? And that gave me tremendous simcha. And I believe, please God, our neighborhood, that this is the last korban, this is the last disaster for the Jewish people after 2,000 years in Iran and the grandstands in Israel. Okay, so let's talk about establishment in Israel. So from a historical point of view, it's unbelievable. From a spiritual point of view, it's exactly what we learn in Parshat and Tzavim, that we will come back to the land of Israel. Hashem empties out Europe, something happens. In South Africa, Jews have a great laugh. In South Africa, Jews come home. Okay, South America, Argentina, the bombing, Jews are coming home from South America. France, 720,000 Jews lived in France 20 years ago. Today, there's about 500 some odd thousand Jews. 20% have left the Eretz Israel. There's a poll taken last year, I believe. 75% of French Jews under the age of 30 see themselves in Israel. And we, the American Jews, okay, we're the last big reservoir. And I believe Lubavitch Rebbe said that we're not going to go bent down, we're going to go with simcha. But you see, country after country, Hashem is shutting down, God is shutting down Galut, okay? And by the way, last year, 2000, and this past year, for the first time in 2,000 years, the majority of the Jewish people now live in Israel. Wave after wave after wave, the majority, and it has tremendous spiritual consequences, because when the majority of the Jewish people live in Israel, we're allowed to have a Sanhedrin. And have Mashiach, you have to have a Sanhedrin. You can't have a Sanhedrin without Mashiach. So this is going to have to be discussed in the next couple of years. So the majority of the Jewish people now live in Israel. Country after country, British, Anglo Jewry, French Jewry, European Jewry is shutting down. Please God, we're all going to get there. Established in the state of Israel, beginning of the redemption. So if you would ask anyone, if they were an adult, where were they in 1947 when the UN declared that Israel should be partitioned? They could tell exactly where they were. It was such a for instance, if you ask anyone that was alive and older, where were they when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? They could tell exactly where they were. In our generation, you ask anyone, where were you at 9/11? They could tell exactly where they were at 9/11. Right? They'll tell you in an upvote when they heard. The same thing was true in 1948. Yes, any Jew that was around, was adult, that's how monumental, and we take this for granted. Okay, so let's talk about Zachor Yemos Olam. Let's talk about seeing Hashem in our generation. And even though things look so dark, again, last we discussed, if you ask this sunflower in underground, Mr. Sunflower, how are you? I'm rotting, it's dank, it's hot, it's human, it's disgusting, I'm rotting. And Mr. Sunflower, you have to understand, this is going to lead to you becoming a 10-foot tall sunflower, okay? So too, all of this, and the pain, the suffering, somehow, when we get to the other side, when Mashiach will come. So 1948. So 1948, there were about 600,000 Jews living in the land of Israel, 300,000 men, 300,000 women and children. And by the way, Rabbi Wein says this in his book. By the way, this lecture was a lecture I heard from Rabbi Beryl Wein, okay? And some Rebbe Younger, of course. So in 1948, there were 600,000 Jews living in the land of Israel, 300,000 men, 300,000 women and children. And Rabbi Wein says that most of the people were survivors who had come, let's say, right after the war, after 45, and these were not, to paraphrase, normal people. In that, they had witnessed their mothers and fathers and children massacred. In 1948, okay, the State Department of the United States, okay, said even if the UN gives Israel a partition, they'll never survive against 100 million Arabs. So again, Zechariah Mas Olam, this is our generation. Okay, so historical. So in 1948, there were 600,000 Jews living in the country. And if the Arabs would have approved, acquiesced to the partition plan, there would have been, Jews would have seen 14,000 square kilometers of land. There would have been 600,000 Jews, and there would have been 600,000 Jews, 450,000 Arabs, which meant, demographically speaking, there have been almost as many Arabs in the land of Israel as Jews. And by the way, 80% of the land that the UN was going to give us, okay, was the Negev. But nevertheless, the Jews were willing to accept that. So they had a very, very thin area, Gush Dan, the Tel Aviv coast, but we were willing to accept that 80% of the land. And what will happen, and we'll see this throughout the modern day state of Israel, is the Arabs would have been so much better off if they just would have accepted the state. Okay, so there would have been 14,000 kilometers, 600,000 Jews, 450,000 Arabs. Okay, and what happened? And the Arab state, they would have had 12,000 kilometers. There would have been 650,000 Arabs and 850 Jews. What happened after that? Because they wouldn't accept the partition plan, there's a war of independence, and we end up getting 21,000 square kilometers. Again, Zechariah Mas Olam, remember your history. It doesn't make sense. They would have accepted. Okay, this is the beginning of the Gula. Okay, so what happens? And by the way, the scenario again put into Abba Eben in the book Civilization of the Jews. This will replay throughout the modern state of Israel. The Arabs would have just accepted, but there was a different plan. Okay, so what happens? So there's a man by the name of Ralph Bunche. He was a diplomat. He actually won the Nobel Prize for what is that I'm about to tell you. He organized some Kew Gardens, actually. So he worked on an armistice in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. By the way, Iraq still never signed an armistice. So Egypt, Jordan, and Syria made an armistice in 1948, 1949, after fighting for 6 months or so. And they had an armistice. Okay, what happened? In 1948, there are 250,000 Jews living in DP camps in Europe. And even our great country that we love, God bless America, but America would not take in these refugees. There's 250,000 Jews languishing in DP camps. And by the way, DP camps were as horrible as the concentration camps, except they weren't killing Jews. Deplorable sewage, deplorable conditions. 250,000 Jews, they had nowhere to go by and large. In fact, again, I'm getting political, but we have a person, Jared Kushner, and Jared Kushner's aunt, Mrs. Lola, of my community, was actually born in a DP camp. Okay, his grandparents, Ray and Joseph Kushner, actually were settled in Italy in a DP camp. Okay, so 250,000 Jews were living in DP camps with nowhere to go. And then came the state of Israel. Between 1948 and 1950, between 1948 and 1950, 260,000 Jews emigrated to the land of Israel because the floodgates opened up. Most of them all came from Europe. They're all Holocaust survivors. So just imagine now, 600,000 people taking 260,000. That's like America taking in 25, 30, 40 million people within 2 years. Can you imagine? Talk about the immigration policies. So between 1948 and 1950, 260,000 people came to the land of Israel. There was no infrastructure. There was no food. And yet, Zechariah Mas Olam, remember your history, the country kept moving. Between 1950 and 1954, another 800 some odd thousand Jews came from countries such as Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Iraq, Turkey, Libya. They were the first casualties of 1948. Jews have lived in these countries for almost 2,000 years in all these Arab countries, and they were kicked out. So we know what we have in Miami, New York, Chicago, after 30, 40, 50, 70 years. Imagine these Jews lived in these communities for 2,000 years. They left penniless. They came to America. Look at them. They came to Israel. 800,000 people within the next 4 years. So you're adding 260, another 800,000. Right? These people had zero, nothing. And I'll share with you a story. So I was leading a birthday trip in Jerusalem, the old city, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning. And in Israel, I don't feel anything except for the cold in the winter, usually, but I don't feel the heat. I was walking in the old city. I have my 40 birthriders, and I see an elderly Sephardic man with a wood, a beam on his shoulder with 2 pails. Okay, he was in construction, kablan. So I said, Shalom Aleichem. I said to him, Shalomcha, Seder, how are you? He goes, Sababa. He's in Hebrew, because I'm amazing. So I said to him, why are you amazing? He said, Melati, I was born in Iraq. So I don't know if you know this, but in Baghdad before 1948, 50% of Baghdad was Jewish, right? Manhattan, very Jewish. Baghdad, the Jews are very wealthy. They were there for many, many years. So he said, in 1948, okay, again, when Israel was established as a country, overnight, these 10, 12 Arab countries kicked out all the Jews, Algeria, Tunisia. By the way, before Gaddafi passed away, according to his aunt on Israeli television, said Gaddafi was Jewish, but friends of mine who were from the Libyan community, there were 10,000 Jews living in Libya before 1948. They all left. Many of them went to Rome, and there was $1 billion modern day of real estate and property. And Gaddafi was working with the Libyan Jewish community to return that property. Then he passed away. Okay. Anyway, so what happened was overnight, 95% of the Iraqi Jews left. They've been there for 2,000 years, left homes, they left summer homes, they left everything behind. They talk about refugee rights. Okay. So back to this man. So this man says, my grandparents, literally walked to the deserts from Iraq to Israel. So I said to myself, why are you sababa? He's making 15 shekels an hour, 20 shekels an hour. He said, because my life is so amazing. I came from Manhattan. Everyone's miserable. Sorry, New York. Okay, everyone's okay. So I said, why are you sababa? Why are you amazing? He said, because if you would have said to my grandparents, I am rebuilding Yerushalayim. So the kids, my birthright kids, were asking, Steve, what's going on with these? I said, this is too deep. We got to discuss this on the bus. He goes, who would have believed that? And his grandparents were very wealthy. Again, if you know anything about Iraqi Jews, they were very wealthy. They left everything behind. He says, I am rebuilding Yerushalayim every day. I'm going to build a home now in the Rov Yehudi, the Jewish quarter. Okay, so again, 1950, 1954, 800,000 Jews. And they, by the way, they never would have left unless they had to leave. All these countries, overnight, all these countries, by and large, left. Okay, so now let's talk about sociology. You have people coming to the country, different cultures, different languages. What did a Jew from Budapest, what did a Jew from Germany have in common with a Jew from Iraq or Tunisia, Morocco? Okay, different languages, different upbringing. Right? You have a polygon of languages, of cultures. It's mind-boggling. So what did they do with all these people? Where did they put them? Again, Zachari Mas Olam, to remember your history, the nace, the great miracle, is they built large mabarot, cities, camp cities, tents that went miles and miles. So those of you who live in Miami, that's like going from South Beach up to Sunny Isles, miles and miles and miles of tent cities. Okay, all these refugees, right? For those of you who live in Manhattan, that's like going from 14th Street, Greenwich Village, up into Washington Heights, miles and miles. Amazing nace. The great miracle was they left. And by the way, this housing problem will persist until the 1960s. They all found housing. Now comes the great nace. Here comes the great bracha. Because the Arabs, and this is documented, I know people are going to say I'm politically correct, but it's facts. You have radio transmission. The Arabs had told their people, leave Israel because it'll be harder to slaughter the Jews than if you live there. And that's where the refugee problem came from. I heard the video, I heard the tape myself, that Menachem Begin, they begged people, stay, we'll build the country together. So what happened was cities like Lod and Ramla and Jaffa and Haifa, Akko, Nazareth, they left en masse. And again, they were projecting that we would do to them what they would have done to us. And just share a quick story of a dear friend of Benny Friedman from Israelite, who lives in Eretz Israel, lives in the Frat. I started a yeshiva in the old city with Rabbi David Aaron. Anyway, he told me a story when he was a commander, captain in the Israeli army. They were in Lebanon, and they came into a village, I'm sorry, this is not so sneeze, not so modest, and all the women in the village in Lebanon were naked. Bubbies, grandmothers, 20-year-olds, 50, all the girls had undressed. Why? Because they didn't want to be murdered because the Israeli soldiers would rape them. Just take us. So Captain Benny Freeman said, put your clothes on, because they were projecting on us what they would do. We all know what happened in Lebanon, the wars of phalanges and the Muslims. So because the Arabs spread all these lies that the Jews were going to kill them and rape them, they left. And what happened. Because they left, we had all these cities where these refugees from all these countries moved into. Okay, this is reality. And by the way, there's many thousands of dunam of land in the Galilee. To this day, no one's developing this land because there's still a question mark who owns the land. Okay, even though they're not coming back. Okay, so what happens? You have a huge sociological problem in Israel, because you have people from all these different countries, different cultures, different languages. So you have these mabarot, these cities, polyglot cultures. So anyone that has relatives who lived in Israel in the 1950s, ask them what life was like. So I had my uncle Dave, hi Mom, my uncle Dave Fern, was one of the founders of ShopRite supermarkets. If you look at something from ShopRite, will say Rate Fern, another story, Pathmark he started. My uncle Dave was invited by the state of Israel to help build the supermarket industry. So he went there. This is the 1950s. It was a big deal in Israel. And he helped start a supermarket chain called Supersol. Okay, Supersol. Any case, when my Uncle Dave came to Israel in the 1950s, there was no poultry. You were given ration tickets, one piece of chicken per month for protein. So my cousin Mela, whose husband was in Dachau, in the early stages of the war, they said to the Jews, just leave your property, leave your homes, and just get the heck out of here. My cousin Mela took her husband out of Dachau. They came to Israel and Tel Aviv. And her house was like the last house by Dizengoff, and he came staying. Anyway, my cousin Mela, my Uncle Dave Ferns, a one of Bracha, a very wealthy man in the 1950s, was coming. And what did she do? She saved all these pieces of chicken every month because her husband was emaciated after living in Dachau. She saved all this chicken per month. So my Uncle Dave should have a proper Seder, have chicken. That's how bad things were. So there was a program established in the 1950s called the SOVA program. SOVA, the satiated. So what was this program all about? Is that you would buy a certificate in America, and then your relatives in Israel would pick up the certificate, and they would be able to get 2 eggs, a piece of chicken. It's a char you must own. By the way, I'm not so old, but I remember as a kid, it wasn't so long ago, I had to bring toilet paper and tuna fish and to Eretz Israel. Today, for money, you can get wasabi. You can get anything you want. All right. This is the 1950s. Then you have an operation called Operation Magic Carpet. This is one of the first times El Al became the airline of the Jewish people. Is that you had Jews living in Yemen that lived there for we call them Spartan, but they weren't Spartan. They come from Spain. They had come there after the first temple. You had hundreds of thousands of Yemenite Jews. They were all airlifted overnight. 200,000-300,000. And by the way, not being disparaged, but the Yemenite Jews had never seen a refrigerator. They never saw a car. They never saw a toilet. Okay, you're bringing them to the 200,000-300,000 Jews. There's a movie called the name was Operation King Solomon. Okay, so they were thrown out in one day. All the Jews in Yemen had to leave. Again, 800,000, 360,000. Now, Yemenite Jews, and the country had no infrastructure. All right. So again, now you have a major philosophical, metaphysical, sociological issue. What's going on is majority of the Jews who came from the Sephardic countries, they might not have been totally observant, but their perspective when they practiced Judaism was halachic, was traditional, was through Torah eyes. There was no such thing as reform or conservative reconstructionists. It's basically they were very traditional, not observant. Now you have survivors of Europe, not judging, that went through hell on earth, and you have a different culture. This is all going on in the state of Israel. Okay, you could have major civil war. You had these different cultures. Okay, secular, socialist, etc. And then you have a tremendous issue. What the role of religion is going to be in the state of Israel? You have people survive the Holocaust. Are you really going to talk about religion now? Right? Shem, you know what happened in Buchenwald, in Auschwitz? And you have Jews who are from the Sephardic countries. Again, they have a different point of view. This is all going on. And by the way, the struggle of religion from the 1950s will continue right into this day. Okay, so what happens now? You have the next generation, okay, of Sephardic children, and very often children of immigrants, they want to be Israeli. They don't want to be necessarily Jewish. So now you have this cultural conflict going on between the observing parents, observing grandparents, kids who want to be cool, and this is going on. So you have this whirlpool of all these different things going on. All right. So the new generation rejected the ways of their parents. They wanted to be modern. They wanted to be American. They wanted to be Israeli. Okay. So what happens now? So Israel has a very peculiar way of government, okay, very similar to Italy, is you don't vote for the person, you vote for the party. In 1948, okay, you think we have problems, issues with Republicans, Democrats? In 1948, there were 22 different parties. And the way the government set up is there's 120 seats in the government, the Knesset. You need 61 seats in order to form the government. So what happens is, in order to form the government, this is the whole balagan, this is the craziness with Bennett, is you need to get all these different factions to be part of the government. So in order to get the religious parties in 1948 to join the government, Ben-Gurion had to make a deal with all the religious parties. And that's why you have this, the status quo. And that's why buses don't run in Eretz Israel, except for Haifa. Haifa was the only exception because Haifa, half the city was Arab. These were Israeli citizens. Haifa, half the city was Arab, and Haifa is the only city in Israel that allowed buses. And this is why the banks and all government offices are closed, because Ben-Gurion had to bring in religious parties. And one of the reasons that, hello, Mike, please come, Mike. It's okay.
No, it's good. I know, I'm doing the space.
You just got really nice people coming in. Okay. Okay. So please take. Okay, so the reason, and by the way, this whole discussion about the state of Israel is still going on today. What is the role of Judaism in the state of Israel? Is it a country with a majority are Jews, or is it a Jewish state? But the reason why, and again, I'm not judging. If I were not a practicing Jew, why should I not be able to use a bus? I pay taxes, I go into the army. Why shouldn't I be able to go to the bank, right? And this is a very big, but again, the reason why Ben-Gurion made the deal was because he wanted the religious party to be in the government. This is the status quo. Okay, then came a big balagan again, a tremendous divisive thing, was who's a Jew? Who is Jewish? Is it because your mother, your father? That's another whole issue in the early years. Okay, then again, Zachariah Masalom, remember your history. Something happens in the country that could have been civil war. What happens? The Jews are very optimistic. We kvetch and we complain, but the Jews had believed that eventually the Arabs would accept the state of Israel, right? In Europe, they said we really weren't French, we really weren't German, we really weren't Hungarian. And then in Israel, they said you don't belong here. So where do we belong? Okay. So what happened was the Jews in Israel believed there was going to be peace. The Arabs would have to accept it. In the 1950s, they realized that we did not have enough men in the army. Okay. we didn't have enough men. So then they proposed universal draft, that women would have to be drafted into the army. And the ones that really protested a lot were the Arabs in the Knesset, because this was an affront. This was disgusting to them that women would be drafted into the army. And that's why this national service, that's why the women it wasn't compulsory. So there's a very, very famous situation that Ben Gurion met the chief rabbi of Israel at the time, the Chazon Ish, and he said, what's going to go on here? We need more people in the army, men and women, okay? And the Chazon Ish cited Baba Metzia, Gemara, the Talmud, and there's a discussion whether if I'm going up a hill with a camel laden with goods, another horse is going up the hill, which one can go first? And the way the Talmud discusses is which one is more laden with stuff. If the horse or the camel going up is laden with goods, it's easier for the other camel or horse to let the other one come up. So Ben Gurion said the Chazon Ish, who has it more challenging? An observant person, a woman, who has to be halacha, has to be traditional. So Ben Gurion backed off, and that's why women weren't forced into the army. Again, there could have been a civil war right then and there. And then came another situation in the 1950s, 1960s, that could have caused a civil war in the state of Israel. Okay, again, Zechor Yimas Olam, remember your history, Hashgacha, the divine providence, is Germany, no matter what we say about the German Republic, but Germany is the only one in Europe that basically owned up to what they did in the Holocaust. And they started a thing called, everyone? Reparations, exactly, reparations. That the Germans were going to pay Jews who survived reparations. And this could have been a civil war. Okay, I'm not judging. There were Jews who said, how could we possibly take blood money from the Nazis who killed my mother, my father, my children? And there are other who said, let them pay. And that's one of the reasons why in the early 1960s, you had so many Mercedes-Benz, because the Germans had given all kinds of economic incentives and monies to build Mercedes, bringing the cars. But again, it was brother against brother. So one of my mentors, teachers, Rebbe Tanesha Yronga, has told me that her father would not accept a dollar bill from the Germans. How could I take a dollar for all my grandparents and my aunts and uncles who were killed? Again, but this could have brought down the country. There could have been a civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people were against each other. Right, Reb? And then there's another issue. Is now, okay, again, basically the 1950s, no one had money. Ashkenazim didn't have money. Spartan didn't have money. Now, all of a sudden, you're changing the dynamics. You have the Goldbergs, who lost their mothers and fathers. They lost their mothers and fathers and grandparents, etc. And the next door neighbor, the Sharabis, Spartan, they have tremendous feeling for their brothers and sisters. But now the Goldbergs are getting $200, $300, $400, whatever it was a month more. That was a tremendous amount of money. So now I'm an Ashkenazi family. I have another 300, 400, 200, whatever the amount of money was. Now I can move to a better neighborhood. I can open a business. My children wear better clothes. Again, people are people, and that caused tremendous amount of stress between Ashkenazim and Spartan, as though there weren't other issues. So now all the survivors and their families had a leg up. Again, we're not judging, but people are people. So now the people who survived the war were getting more money. And again, if anyone ever has been up against it financially, if you have a parent or grandparent selling you the extra $500 a month, that can make a difference between nice suit, extra trip. So again, Zechor Yimas Olam, okay, and somehow, and by the way, at the same time, we have external threat. You have Arabs who are constantly threatening us. 1948, the Suez War, 67, etc. And what is now going to change things amazingly? Again, Hashgacha, Zechor Yimas Olam, remember your history, was the invention of an organization called Israel Bonds. Today, Israel Bonds doesn't have the same power, but Israel Bonds, the idea of Israel Bonds, will change the country amazingly. So basically, Israel Bonds, that you would lend the state of Israel money at 3-4%. I remember my grandfathers all used to buy Israel Bonds. I don't know why they called this tzedakah, because getting for, because nobody ever believed that the state of Israel would ever pay back Israel bonds. Okay, people say, Mr. Goldberg, $10,000, because they never believed there were 15 or 17-year-old bonds. They never believed they would ever pay it back. So just to tell you a story of Miami, that 1960, I believe, when Castro overthrew Batista, the prime minister of Cuba, the Jews left. The Jews were very wealthy in Havana. I'm sorry? 1959. Batista was overthrown, the leader of Cuba. Castro came in, and the Jews were by and large very wealthy, business people, hotels, and they left by and large with nothing. They couldn't leave with anything except one thing. And what was that? Their Israel bond certificates. Why? Because Castro, these bonds were issued in the 1950s, didn't believe that these bonds would ever be worth anything because they were maturing in 15, 20 years from then. So Castro let the Jews leave with their Israel bonds, and the Israeli government, Israel bonds, in a special thing, they allowed the Cuban Jews to cash out. And it's interesting how the Jews were rewarded with a bitachon, with their emunah, by buying Israel bonds. They purchased a very large growth. And the many Cuban Jews in Miami were fabulously wealthy today because they were able to leave with that money. So meter measure for measure. Okay, so what will Israel bonds do? Israel bonds will establish the cement business. So in the 1950s, 1960s, cement was a huge business in Israel. As a country was developing and taking in all the hundreds of thousands of immigrants, cement was a very big thing. Israel became a very big producer of cement, which was built with the money from Israel bonds. In fact, if you ever drive from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv, you'll see on the south side of the road, get rid of the road, you'll see these two smokestacks, and that was like 70% of the cement manufactured in Israel. In fact, it's interesting that Adolf Eichmann, after he was hung, they actually incinerated him there because they didn't want to have a physical body where, God forbid, down the road, followers they incinerated him in that cement factory. Okay, so 1950s, Israel bonds established the cement factories. It's a very big business. The other thing Israel bonds established was the development of potash. Potash in the 1950s was extracted from the Dead Sea, and it was used for agriculture. Israel was one of the largest manufacturers of potash. Today, the Chinese are the major exporters, but potash was a huge cash industry that brought a lot of cash into Israel because of Israel bonds. Another thing Israel bonds established, and we have survivors from Antwerp, from Belgium. They came to Israel and they established, with the help of Israel bonds, the diamond industry in Ramat Gan. And at one point, every diamond almost in the world was polished by a Jew in Ramat Gan, Tel Aviv. 70% of the world's diamonds were polished in Tel Aviv. Today, India is now one of the largest. They've outcompeted Israel, but now India is one of the largest polishers. But up until not so long ago, Ramat Gan was one of the largest polished diamonds in the world, 70%. And now Israel bonds helped create the diamond industry in Israel. Agriculture. So today we know that Israel is a high-tech country, but up until the 1960s, 1970s, Israel was a major exporter of Jaffa oranges and grapefruits, and et cetera, et cetera. And people don't know, by the way, that we call them Dutch tulips. Most tulips, as babies, begin in Eretz Israel. They're first grown in Israel. By the way, if you've ever been to a Chinese restaurant, Manhattan, Chicago, LA, most of the koi fish, decorative fish, I don't know for sure, but maybe if you go to Bal Harbor shops and you see the koi fish, maybe their boobies and zaydas came from the Jordan Valley. But Israel is one of the largest exporters of koi fish, came from Israel. So again, this was all established in the state of Israel: agriculture, diamonds, potash, et cetera, et cetera. And then Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the state of Israel, his vision was that Israel didn't have coal, we didn't have natural resources, but we had one resource, and that is Jewish brains. He envisioned Israel as a country that would export Jewish brains. And by the way, I'm a Wall Street guy, but if you look on New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, Israel's number 3 in terms of countries being listed. America, China, then comes Israel. Israel is one of the smallest countries in the world that today, nothing in the high-tech world basically happens without Eretz Israel. So when people say they hate Israel, boycott Israel, BDS, ask them, where did the cell phone come from? It came from Israel in 1991. Again, Zachariah Mas Olam, remember your history, look at the Hashgacha, the divine providence. 1990, 1 million Russian Jews come to Israel, 57% have engineering degrees. What would they have done with these people? It came exactly the same moment as the high-tech revolution. AOL Messenger service, WhatsApp, EasyPass, Waze, all came from this country. They went on BDS. Again, right? Zachariah Masalam, remember your history, the beginning of the Gula. So Chaim Weizmann's dream that Israel, by the way, in terms of medicinal marijuana research, Israel's #1 in marijuana research. Okay, I think it was Bill Gates who once said that Microsoft wasn't a company that had resources in Israel. It's basically an Israeli company that has resources in America. That almost all of the first semiconductor chip came from Eretz Israel. That's correct. Okay, but what will the Israel bonds do that will change the face of the country? Was they'll establish the national water carrier. So those of us who've been to Eretz Israel, I hope everyone here, everyone listening of Israel, please go, we shall get there soon, one way or the other, was we know that topographically Israel looks like this. You have the Galil, and then goes down, right? We know that Dead Sea is the lowest point of the earth. Is they built a national water carrier. At one time, the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, was 70% of Israel's water. So when we daven, those of us who are traditional, when we daven, when we pray that it should rain in Israel after Sukkot, we are not davening necessarily should rain in Tel Aviv, should rain there, and we're not praying that should rain in Beersheba. We're praying should rain in the Kinneret, because at one time, 70% of all Israel's water, potable water, came from the Kinneret. Today, Israel's #1, by the way, in terms of recycling water. I believe 80% of Israel's water is recycled. I think Spain is probably 15%. And Israel is probably, I don't know if it's finished, building the largest desalination plant in the world. But 70% of Israel's water will come from the Dead Sea, which is another whole thing. Israel, Zachariah Masalam, remember your history. Okay, so what happens is the water came from the Kinneret, from the Galilee, and then they had 4 major pumping stations, and from those 4 pumping stations, the water would go to the south. So cities like Arad, the Negev, cities like Beersheba, okay, they were able to push Beersheba 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers into the desert because of the water that came to Kinneret, and that water, the pumping stations came from Israel bonds, okay, changed the country. So again, for those of us who know, in Israel, it doesn't rain from basically Pesach into October, November. So the Kinneret was the great reservoir of the state of Israel, and the national water carrier built by Israel Bond will change the country. All right, cities like Arad and Tivot were built by that. Okay, and then again, Zachariah Mas Olam, open your eyes, look at the Gula, look at the redemption coming. In 1990, I remember there was a family, very big philanthropist by the name of the Reichman family. So kind of like Paul Reichman and Albert Reichman, and they were building a whole city in London called Canary Wharf. They're building this huge, huge city, filling in the water called Canary Wharf. And I saw the video. So Paul Reichman, Zohar Bracha, went to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and said, "Can I have a bracha to build Canary Wharf?" And they were sabotaged by Prince Charles. That's not a story. Anyway, he lobbied against them to build the underground. Anyway, so the Rebbe said to them, "Why are you putting in billions and billions of dollars building Canary Wharf? Why aren't you building cities in Eretz Israel? Because the Russian Jews are coming home." This was 1987, 88, 89. Okay, and they looked at him going, "Rebbe, just give me a bracha, just bracha for Canary Wharf." Meanwhile, that was their Waterloo. Okay, of course, that Canary Wharf caused their bankruptcy. They were 10 billion, 12 billion, big philanthropists. But imagine that they would have built cities and factories, okay, for 1 million Russian Jews came in. But again, look at the bracha. 57% of the Russian Jews had engineering degrees at the same time, the beginning of the high-tech revolution, and they were all channeled into the high-tech industry. So again and again and again. So today, Israel, nothing in the high-tech world moves without the state of Israel. So Chaim Weizmann's dream, the Jews will be able to export their grains. Okay, so what did we learn tonight? So then when we learn that no matter how dark things might look, that we have to open our eyes that the Gula, the redemption is coming. The Jewish people returning, country has to come to Eretz Israel. That Israel, with all the problems and all the wars, is flourishing. We have to be very, very careful. So Shlomo Carlebach, Zechron Bracha, is to say you have to have Mashiach eyes. You go to Israel, we see this issue, that issue. Look has been done 78 years. A country that was third world, 1948, they're still third world. That Israel is cutting edge. Yes, there are issues. You have to have Mashiach eyes. Look how we've come. Country after country, cities, highways. It's amazing. And if you go to Israel, you see cranes. Okay, next is we have to see what's going on in the bigger picture. That we only see the negativity. Is 2,000 years, the Jewish people were still alive. We're building. We're getting connected. So, and then again, I want to just reiterate: is our sages teach us very clearly why did we have to fast yesterday? Why this horrible, horrible day? Because 2,000 years ago, we were keeping Shabbat, we're keeping Kashrut, we're doing everything we had to do, but one thing was lacking, and that was Sinas Chinam. The Jews had stuff with each other, we maligned each other, we were jealous of each other. Again, 2,000 years later, it's enough already. So now we're in a very, very up time. This Shabbos is called Shabbos Nachamu. It's Shabbos of comfort. Is the negativity is behind us on every level, individually, collectively, is that we have to, non-Jews, my best friend, we have to do more chesed, more kindness, more love, more acceptance of every Jew. And please God, this will bring in the final Gula, final redemption of the Jewish people. Again, I want to thank my friend Moses for sponsoring the class in memory of Esti, Miriam, and Israel Volk. And thank you, Laura Seelig. And again, we want to dedicate all the learning tonight to all our holy brothers and sisters who perished in the tragedy and all the sake of the Jewish people. And again, there's more chesed, more kindness. And with that, I want to thank all of you. Good night, Mom. Good night, my cousin Leslie. Next Monday night, I have a class. For those of you who are listening within the Miami corridor, Friday night, we have a Shabbos dinner, Karbach, singing, joy, happiness. What else? July 25th, we have a special class in Bal Harbor, Surfside on health. So the 20s and 30s, everyone's welcome. And then this week, I just started working on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We're going to have explanatory experience for young people at the Young Israel. So no Jew should not feel connected. And I want to thank my friend Alex Manifold, who is helping out. Stacy, thank you. Ariella, and Shabbat Tov. And we go from here. Thank you very much, guys. Yeah.
Hey.